Hi, everybody. This is Julinna Oxley from Grand Strand Action Together. And I'm here tonight to have a discussion with Shakedra Jenerette and Matt Wilkinson on the state of policing in South Carolina. So this is our second live stream that we've had. We had another one last Tuesday night with Damian Fowler and Dr. Jenny Schlosser from the Sociology Department at Coastal Carolina University. So we had a lot of interest in that discussion. So we're having a second one this week with 2 additional respondents. I'd just like to remind you before we begin that Grand Strand Action Together is a nonprofit organization. And though Matt and I are both employees of Coastal Carolina University, we are not speaking on behalf of the university, and nor are we speaking for the organization Grand Strand Action Together, because we don't necessarily have a unified platform that we are promoting as an organization. Our goal is to foster discussion and education regarding issues of race and racial justice. And so we're going to have this discussion tonight in order to further that end. So thanks everybody for joining us tonight. I'm really excited about this. So let me introduce the folks who I'm going to be talking to tonight. So first of all, we're going to be talking with Shakedra Jenerette. Shakedra is a local activist that lives in Loris, South Carolina. She is a spoken word performer and she has 5 adorable children. She is a strong advocate and a fundraiser for Black and Brown children in Horry County. She organized a really cool event called Run for the Culture. It was a race for children in Loris, and that happened thankfully right before we all went on quarantine back in March. So that's, well, one more thing about Shakedra. In addition, she wears lots of different hats. She is the founder of I Am Enough, and this is a nonprofit organization that she runs. Or I think it's actually a service organization. I should be more specific. The mission of I Am Enough is to empower women, children, and families with the knowledge and skills necessary to end the generational impact of negative thinking and living. The motto that she seeks to instill in everyone is the following: no matter what you've done or what has been done to you, good, bad, or indifferent, you were then and are now and will always be enough. And I always love reading that quote. All right, our second guest who we have with us tonight is Dr. Matt Wilkinson. Matthew Wilkinson is an associate professor of sociology at Coastal Carolina University. His research focuses on the role of social integration in the construction and maintenance of identity and its influence on mental health. His recent work examines the relationships between martial arts training, violence, and aggression. He currently teaches courses in criminology, juvenile delinquency, deviance, the sociology of violence, and sociological theory. I would probably need to take all those classes. So this sounds super interesting.
Most of the time they are, yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, again, I can't remember if I introduced myself or not, but I'm Julinna Oxley. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. I'm on the philosophy side, and my specialization is in feminism, ethics, and political theory. So, all right, well, we're excited to start this discussion tonight. I think Shakedra is still getting set up. She had a work thing to go a little bit longer than expected today. So I'm going to begin by asking the opening question, and I'm assuming that Matt will start and then Shakedra will jump in next. So we are experiencing a really important cultural moment where we've not had this much civil rights activism in the last 50 years with the death of George Floyd. And this has really motivated a big movement for the Black Lives Matter movement. And so what is your opinion of the unprecedented movement regarding policing and the rights of especially Black Africans or Black African Americans in the United States today?
Okay, so hell of a question to start off with, right?
Yes, it is.
You know, it's interesting. It's not interesting, it's depressing that several years ago there was this little push by some people to get Black Lives Matter designated as a terrorist organization. And unfortunately, I had a few people on my own social media feeds, including a few police officers who were trying to argue for this. Of course, BLM is not, nor was it ever, a terrorist organization. But now we're seeing record levels of public support for this movement, while at the same time a renewed push to get the KKK labeled as a terrorist organization, which it is still not. So I think that tells you quite a bit that the people who are angrily pushing to get BLM to be labeled as a terrorist organization had nothing to say about some of these white supremacist groups not having that label. And now the landscape that they're facing has changed. So I think the main thing that has caused the shift is that, and this is probably speaking more to the white public, and obviously from my own experience as a white guy in this society, is I think that our bubble of protection is gone. For so long, so many of us have been able to live within our own bubbles and to shut out what's happening. That's part of privilege, right? It means we can turn away, and we do, because things make us uncomfortable. If it doesn't affect us personally or immediately, we can turn away, and that's a defense mechanism. But we passed this threshold, I believe. We couldn't turn away because the image of George Floyd was so visceral and so undeniable and so inexcusable, right? And so immediately after that, we were faced with image after image of peaceful protesters receiving excessive force at the hands of law enforcement. And the one that still stands out was I think it was a 75-year-old man in Buffalo who was shoved to the ground, and they walked by him as he was bleeding. Pepper spraying peaceful protesters, pulling down the mask of a protester to spray him in the face. So I think that kind of made it where we can't turn away. And I'll stop there. I could go on, but I won't. It's we're forced to look, and we feel this momentum. And for some people, they're just kind of now paying attention, and that's fine. Better late than never. But there's no way to turn away and to dismiss and discredit and kind of ignore the problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it helps that everyone is very active on social media right now, because we're in a pandemic. And so people have more time and more energy and more willingness to pay attention to what's happening in the world, and more social awareness as well. So I think it's awesome. I think it's really exciting. I've had a number of my former students to contact me and tell me how involved they are. And so it's like, it's something that we haven't seen before, at least, since I was born. So, which was after the Civil Rights Movement. I know I look old, but after the Civil Rights Movement. So we're still waiting for Shakedra. There she is. Perfect timing. Hey.
Right on cue.
How are you doing?
We're great. So happy to see you now. Yay.
Yes.
Love your hat.
So if you could repeat the question so that I can answer accurately, please, and thank you.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so the question is, what do you think has contributed to the groundswell of interest in the Black Lives Matter movement, which it's been around for about 8 years, but this is the first time that we've had, millions of people marching all over the United States and all over the world for the purposes of Black Lives Matter. What's contributed to that?
I think it's a number of things, but one of the main things being we've all been stuck in the house a lot lately. We've all had time to slow down. So we weren't so busy that we had the opportunity to avoid it. For those of us who constantly has to remind the world that we matter, Black Lives Matter, we weren't the only ones forced to look at what we had been dealing with. So I do believe that because a lot of us were stuck in the house during the quarantine and really weren't as busy as we would normally be, we had the opportunity to actually see it, especially with George Floyd. You know, a lot of us were in the house, and we had the opportunity to actually view what that looks like. It's different when you hear people talking about it as opposed to actually seeing the life leave from someone's body firsthand, whether that be for those people who were there or us who saw it on video. And I still haven't watched the video. I just don't want to subject myself to that trauma. So I personally haven't watched the video, but I think the running theme for those that have seen the video is that it's undeniable the lack of concern and care that was shown by those who were hired to serve and protect.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. You know, having to watch that and to see the lack of concern, utter disregard that it was a human being. I mean, it's like, this is a human being, you know.
Right.
So,
Absolutely.
very, very hard. So given that kind of problem with policing, which we've seen over and over again for the last several years, and actually we should just say for, you know, decades, what would be a good path forward that you would like to see regarding policing in America? I know that there's been some legislation proposed, but there might be other ideas and things that you've seen or that you've talked about. What changes need to take place?
I think individually, I think this begins before officers take that position. So individually, there's some work that needs to be done, but as a system, I think one of the places that we can start is with those police officers that consider themselves to be good police officers, that they are not afraid to do what's right, even if that means going against those that their co-workers. And I think when they do that as a system, they shouldn't be penalized for that. And I do believe that may be one of the reasons that a lot of them will not step in or intervene, because they know they'll be penalized by either losing their jobs or they'll become the black sheep or whatever it is. So I think individually, those people who have those biases should absolutely recognize that they have those biases. But those police officers that consider themselves good cops should most definitely just begin to step up and do the right thing and intervene when they have to. So that's definitely a starting point. But
yeah, no, I think that's great. A lot of people say that, like, the hiring practices should change because of these kinds of things you're pointing out, that like people are going to, if they're, you can't fix somebody in like 2 months, right? So if you start with looking for the kinds of skills that you want somebody to have, you might need to reevaluate the skills that you're looking for.
Right. And I really do believe training needs to be longer, because the most recent, well, I can't say the most recent shooting, but the shooting in Georgia, the police officer who did that shooting actually had all of these classes and trainings on, you know, de-escalating situations and things of that nature. So you can have all of the training that there is to offer, but as a person, if your morals and your characters and your belief doesn't align up with that training, then it's just wasted time.
Yeah, that seems right.
I agree. And on the subject of training, I'm kind of wearing different hats here. I'm a professor of sociology and criminology and a concerned citizen, but also I've had 20 plus years training in martial arts. And one thing I kept seeing, and I do believe, as an aside, that more martial arts training and grappling training is a must for law enforcement. I firmly believe that. However, and some people won't like this, I don't think that more training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu would have stopped George Floyd's murder or some of these other murders, because the intent, is a chokehold used to hold someone down, or is it used to punish and dominate? So someone who is intent on punishing and dominating someone who does not see them as a human being, all the training in the world isn't going to matter. On the other side of that, because, there's the discussion of banning chokeholds. I train with police officers. There's a little 40-pound guy, and he can apply a chokehold to me, and I'll tap out, and he knows when to let go. And I have full confidence that he could, in the least violent way possible, it's still violent, subdue or restrain anyone on the street without it going to that level, because he knows how to do it. He's, a kind, considerate person. So, you're right. Training for some people doesn't matter, because if their intent is to dominate and demean and punish, then they'll use the tools they have at their disposal to accomplish that goal. So that, I think that's worth examining as well.
Mm-hmm. So Matt, can I just follow up on that real quick?
Yes.
I've just never heard this idea pitched before. Maybe I don't hang out in the right circles, but the idea of martial arts training,
Right.
is it because there's a lot of reliance on the gun as like the way to solve problems rather than like physical interaction, or can you just elaborate on that?
So what I can tell you from my experience, and also seeing all of the martial arts community that I'm connected with, they're frustrated because they see people, police officers in these positions where they're high stressed and applying excessive force to the point where someone is injured or to loss of life. And the argument is, if you're more confident in your grappling abilities, you can more calmly handle that situation and only apply the amount of force necessary that actually protects the person and keeps them from getting hurt. And that is it's not what most of the images we see of police brutality. I mean, we see people being slammed to the ground. We've seen being kicked in the head when they're handcuffed. And that's a different set. But when you see someone restraining someone using the right technique, the proper choke or hold is just to keep them restrained. So I think the frustration is trained martial artists are seeing this and going, you're not doing it right. And if you had more experience, you'd be better able to subdue them and keep them in a kind of a safe position.
Yeah,
so that answers the question.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I guess I don't use enough force.
Come take some martial arts lessons.
I know, that's what I need to. And
that's the good thing around here. There are quite a few members of law enforcement who train, and it's good to have that experience with them. I wish there were more training in there. If they have free time, maybe they don't. It's it'd be nice if it was required and there was a more rigorous path through it. But
right.
It absolutely should be. I know I used to work just last year for the South Carolina Department of Corrections.
Okay.
And we get about maybe a half a day of hand-to-hand combat training. I don't recall it being more than maybe a day of hand-to-hand combat.
Right.
That's not enough.
No.
Maybe 2 days. But at the most, that's what it was that I recall. But whatever it wasn't enough because we didn't do it enough.
Yes.
We didn't do it enough, so we weren't comfortable. When I went into those facilities, and I wasn't a corrections officer, I was an drug abuse counselor, but I was still in the dorm with the inmates. So I needed to know how to protect myself, but I wasn't comfortable because I didn't do it long enough for it to be muscle memory. So I would always be in these positions where I would think, okay, if I needed to get myself out of this particular area, would I remember enough of what I was trained to do to be effective? And I did not honestly believe that I had completed that training enough for it to just be like in my muscle memory. Like I just knew that this is what I would have to do. And I think the same goes for police officers too. The training is definitely not long enough. I don't think the training is consistent enough. I know with some offices you have to have ongoing training. Like once a year, there are certain credits that you have to keep those particular licenses or certifications. And that should be the case with police officers as well.
And not to continue martial arts, because obviously it's a passion of mine, but I think it's also important to consider or to have experience of what does it feel like to be to be held down, to be choked, to be restrained, and be told to stay still, stop resisting. Because I know if one of those guys, 250-pound guy has his knee on my ribs, I can't just freeze up and be still, because you can't. It's just an automatic, fight or flight response. So I think that more live training, we call it live rolling, would be beneficial to understand that panic and that fear and that pain in that situation.
Yeah.
Right.
That's great. That is super useful. So
Okay.
I want to transition a little bit. This is kind of a similar question, but also takes it up a level to like maybe the political question. But it seems like engaging in criticism of the police is very tricky. There's a lot of people who get very upset as soon as you just start talking about them. And does it seem like there's a difference between criticizing like the legal framework or the public policy framework that police operate in versus talking about like the bad apples or like the people that we're talking about who don't seem to have the personal skills to be able to do their job well? And is the problem with policing, is it an individual problem, or is it like a political, like there basically hasn't been very much legislation of the police in a very long time. And the only real, changes that have been made have been through the judicial system, with Terry stops or Miranda rights. Like these were all, changes that were made as a result of going through the courts. And there's just not been done legislatively, certainly on the national level, and maybe, a handful of states have had some legislation. So does it seem to you that like legislation can solve it, or is it an individual problem? Or is it both? It could be both.
I think if we go back to why the police force was the first act of policing was to catch runaway slaves. Mm-hmm. There were laws put in place that made it legal to do all of these things, and I think as a system, we're still there. We may have dressed it up a little bit, added a little bit of sugar to it, made it smell good, but it's essentially the same thing. So I do, because that is what it began as. The legislation and the laws are tailored to that. For example, to stop and frisk. That mostly affects people that looks like me and my sons, and you know what I mean. Yeah. All of these incidences with use of force. I think it, as a system, it was designed to do what it has continued to do for all of these years, which is to keep their foots or knees or whatever on the necks of Black and brown people. Mm-hmm. And so I do think it's legislation, but it's always been legislation because that's why it was created in the first place, to police us as a whole. I feel like legislation it's difficult to change things that just make sense to me, because it affects me. But if you're so far removed from the things that happen like this, then you're not in a hurry to change or come up with some different legislation, or because it doesn't affect you, you want to throw in some things that have absolutely nothing to do with the issue in order for you to vote for this to pass, which is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. So legislation absolutely is one of the biggest issues. Like, we should have laws. Like, this is what people say, that when a Black person is murdered or injured through use of force by police officers, or when we're pulled over, they'll say, well, if you haven't broken any crimes, you don't have anything to worry about. And when it comes to us creating legislation to hold police accountable, I feel the same way. if you haven't done any crime, then you have nothing to worry about. So passing that legislation that stops shielding them shouldn't be an issue. Because again, if you're not doing any crime or plan on committing any crimes, then it shouldn't be an issue.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I totally agree with that. Go ahead, Matt.
It's kind of, is it, from the sociological perspective, it's not an either or, it's both. Is it bad apples, or is it a systemic kind of cultural problem? And I think that it's, and I say this coming from my hat as a sociologist, a criminologist, that, my students have the hardest time understanding, what does it mean to have like institutional racism or discrimination? We want to zoom in and say it's the result of a few bad actors, right? So the sociological perspective means zooming out and looking at how all of this is connected. So I'll try not to get off on too many stats and data here, but just stop me, wave a flag. If we zoom out and look at Ferguson, right? The Department of Justice review of the police department showed that there was a culture of racism and disrespect towards people of color. This was like 9 months after the incident with Mike Brown. We can even set that aside and not even debate what happened, justifiable, not justifiable. We can put that to the side because people will start arguing, right? And you can find these emails online, I think the jokes that were being exchanged between these officers, and it's hard to read, especially knowing what happened. So you have to realize that that decisions are being made within this environment. Attitudes are being shaped, they're being directed, they're being supported or constrained. And we also have the problem of bystanders, right? Shakedra pointed that out. People not wanting to speak out because they don't want to be seen as being an outcast or disloyal. And that's a part of the problem too. So here's where it's connected, right? The individual bad actors feel empowered in these environments. They feel supported. They feel emboldened. They hear this kind of language and it's permissive. Then they feel like they can act out. So here's some quick stats. I'll try not to go too far into it. So African Americans made up about 2/3 of the population in Ferguson, but according to the Department of Justice, between 2012 and 2014, they accounted for 85% of vehicle stops. So they're about 67% of the population. 85% of vehicle stops, 90% of citations, 93% of arrests, 95% of jaywalking tickets, 94% of tickets for failure to comply. African Americans were twice as likely to be searched, so we get into our stop and frisk, but 26% less likely to be found to be in possession of drugs or weapons. So that needs to be repeated. Right. Stops twice as often, but less likely to be found with weapons or drugs. And you see this, not just Ferguson, with other departments. And so it's hard to say, and you can't say that every single person in that department is racist or is targeting, gets into this kind of implicit bias. It's just part of the way business as usual in the United States. And that's really hard to address. It's much easier to fire this person or that person. The speeding tickets, this is interesting. There was more of a racial disparity for speeding tickets that were given based on an officer's discretion versus radar detectors. So if the ticket was assigned because a device said you're speeding, there wasn't any difference between black and white or Hispanic. But when the officers were saying, based on my judgment, they were speeding, you would see this disparity. So, and I could, of course, go on and on, but we'll probably get to it later. I just wanted to point that out because it's part of this larger culture, this permissiveness, and people can't step forward and challenge that environment.
Yeah, no, those are really, really useful because I think that gives us, just data, right? The hard facts are very useful, right? So even though there's not an intention of racism, people can claim, the result is that it's a racist practice. And so, in theory, right, the law is supposed to address that. It's supposed to address, well, I didn't intend to discriminate, but if, the results of your policies is that they're discriminatory, then they should be fixed. And it is very frustrating that when it comes to policing, none of it has been fixed. And so one of the comments that we got from Damien on the thread, which I'll just read because I think it kind of ties into this, is the question of how to deal with racism in our country. There's a lot of discussion about taking down, monuments or taking down the flag, and a lot of things that seem symbolic, right? Like painting the Black Lives Matter on the, street leading up to the White House. I'm in favor of those kinds of things, but are these kinds of symbolic actions replacing the real legislation that needs to be done? And as Damien calls it, the history of white terrorism, right, which has been going on in this country for a long time. I've had my kids watching movies about desegregation over the last week, and they're just like, oh my God, white people are terrible. And I'm like, yeah, like white people were terrible. So, so the history of all this is, we should, why not call it white terrorism? So I'm just curious about how do we address these issues moving forward? Looking at the symbolic versus the legislation versus the personal work, right?
Right. I think we start in the homes.
Mm-hmm.
It starts in the homes. I'll give you an example. I live in a really nice community, and we have a dog, and she loves to be out in the rain. So she will come when it rains. She will come out of her little house and just sit like in the rain for a little while, chase little things that's hopping in the ground. So right after the George Floyd incident, maybe the next week, it rained quite a few days here. Well, one of my neighbors decided to call the police because the dog was outside in the rain. So the police come to the house and they're saying, hey, we just got a call about a dog being left outside in the rain, and we just want to make sure that she could get back in her house. She's not, tied up or anything. So I'm like, sure, she can get in her house. So we took her in the house. Before he pulled off, she was back out in the rain again. 3 days later, he's back at my door again for the same issue. It's raining. This dog is outside in the rain. So we have a neighborhood thread with just the neighbors in our community. And I go on the thread and I said, with everything that's going on, it's very insensitive to send the police to my house where I have 4 Black sons twice in less than a week.
Yes.
When as a neighbor, you could have just come to my home, or you could have commented to me on a thread, hey, your dog's in the rain. Is she okay? Is she tied up? Is she stuck? Or anything like that. That didn't happen. The neighbor sent the police to my house twice. On this thread, one of my Caucasian neighbors said, why are your children afraid of the police? And I just thought, wow, have you not seen what is going on in the world today? And she says, well, if they haven't done anything, then they shouldn't be afraid, and you shouldn't teach your kids to stereotype police officers, because my husband is a police officer, and you should just bring them over here, and he could tell them that police officers are not bad. What? Then she says, I said, well, you don't get to dictate the lens that my children view the world from. You don't get that right. And then she says, if they come over here, he could just tell them that not all cops are bad. And by the way, we are a biracial family and we don't see color. And I said, well, that's sad, because your biracial children, I don't care how blue their eyes are or how blonde their hair might be, when they go out into the world is going to see their color, and they will be unprepared for what is going to come at them full force, because you have taught them not to see color when they absolutely should see color. And she just kept telling me that I was wrong for teaching my children to stereotype police officers, because she didn't teach her children that, because their dad was a police officer. And so I said, well, I teach my children that when we get pulled over, or my sons, 2 of my sons are driving, that if the police pull them over, don't reach for your wallet. Just get the ticket and we'll fight it later in court. If the police pull you over, don't argue with them. Let them feel like they're right. We'll fight it later in court. Don't make any sudden movements. Don't raise your voice. Don't ask him any questions. Just let him do the talking, because I want you to live long enough for us to fight this. Mm-hmm. And in return, she tells me I'm wrong. And I said, I can't talk to you, because instead of you listening to understand, you are responding to tell me that I am wrong. Mm-hmm. Instead of listening to understand. So that is a major problem that I see when people say, oh, this Black Lives Matter bull crap, and Black people are always whining and all of this stuff, or Black on Black crime. The difference with Black on Black crime is if a Black person kills a Black person, that Black person is going to jail.
Right.
He's going to get arrested. He will get arrested before there is a grand jury. He will get arrested before there's any video. He will get arrested off of word of mouth. We've seen it. Walter Scott was criminalized until the video showed up.
Right.
Yep.
And then we understood what happened. And so it starts in our homes. My children absolutely see color. I didn't even have to teach them that. The world taught them that in daycare.
Yeah.
In elementary school, at Loris High School.
Mm-hmm.
Where my 16-year-old was accused of doing some things, and that was on video. The video clearly showed that it didn't happen. And the police officer told him, well, I have some friends in Horry County Police, and I'll just call one of my friends and I'll have him charge you anyway. A police officer told him that. So I don't have to teach my children anything about police officers.
Yeah.
At 8, 9, and 10, they've already had these experiences. So I think it starts in a home. Don't dictate to me how I have to see the world, because you don't see through my lens. And I told her, I don't get the luxury of not worrying about my children. And she mentioned that, oh, were you in your home? And I said, well, Breonna Taylor was in her home sleeping. Mm-hmm. Tatiana was in her home sleeping. Botham Jean was in his home. Mm-hmm. All of these people were killed by police officers in their home. And it hasn't been so long ago. And for her to not grasp how frustrated I was that someone would send the police to my house twice a week after George Floyd, for her to not grasp why I would be so troubled and upset by that, disturbed me on a level that I still don't think I've quite come to grips yet, because I understand she is not the only one who thinks like that.
Exactly.
Yep, you're right.
And that, it's just a different, the whole idea of not seeing color, right? I don't see color means I have no idea what your experience is like.
Right.
And I don't care. That's so flawed. Now I was thinking, I had a conversation with my parents about what happens when I get pulled over, and it was a little bit different, right? It was ask them what's the probable cause if they want to search the car. Don't let them search your car, whether you have anything or not. And that's a very different conversation than is happening in Black families. And in my classes where we talk about these, white students and Black students start sharing their conversations they have with their police, and you can see some of the white students are just going, I never had a conversation with my family. And then more of the Black students say, well, I was this old and I was this old. And every semester that conversation kind of naturally emerges, and it needs to be had with all of us in the room, because then people go, I have never thought about it that way, because we're looking through this lens,
right,
this frame, and we can't shake that off and see it from the perspective of someone else. So I appreciate
it. Absolutely. We need to zoom out and see it from all perspectives, because I don't get frustrated with people who are willing to, for lack of better words, step into my shoes and try to understand where I'm coming from, as much as I do with people who try to tell me that I have no reason to feel the way that I do. And I think those are the people who are the biggest hindrance to us actually coming to a point where we all can get in the room and effectively have these conversations as opposed to people saying, "Oh no, you're just whining." You know, I really feel like their lack of ability to see it through somebody else's lens is just a hindrance.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. I mean, I think empathy is super important. And it's not clear to me that it's always a skill or an emotion that's encouraged. But if you start in kids young, then they get it, right? That you're supposed to step into somebody else's perspective and see things from their point of view so you can understand what they're going through. Because I think, you know, my parents were in their 70s and my mom said, you know, as a white person, my only experiences with the police are positive. But now I hear this other narrative about how horrible it is for other people, and I want to do something about that, right? I want things to be different. I want to, not, I want them to have the same experience that I have. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do moving forward before we get to that point. So let me ask another question about the role of policing in America and how it's changed in the last 40 or 50 years. It turns out that the violent crime rate has decreased over the last 2 or 3 or 4 decades, but that the funding for police have massively increased. I think locally it's increased by a percentage around, I don't know, maybe 10% or something like that. And then the increased militarization of police. I remember growing up watching the Dukes of Hazzard and stuff like that, where that was what cops did. You might outrun them, you may not, but now it's you see the military all the time. So what do we do about that? It seems like we've got things moving in opposite directions.
One thing that comes to mind, and I think we talked about this, or y'all talked about this last week, is some of these proposals to defund the police or abolish the police or eliminate the police. And, I have my own personal issues with some of that language because I don't think it necessarily paints an accurate picture as to what some of these proposals are trying to do. And so one thing I think is it's the idea of not so much abolishing the police, but challenging this idea that the role of the police in our society is to maintain law and order through the use of force, right? So one of the findings in criminology is that increased police presence does actually have an impact on violent crime, whether it's a deterrence effect, that there's less crime being committed, or an incapacitation effect, but that's such a small percentage of crime. So it doesn't mean we should over-criminalize nonviolent crime, right? We have this growth of funding for police, and it's really not, violent crime was already decreasing before we started throwing money at it. So it's the idea that we need to move away from this militarized version of policing. How do we respond to violent crime versus nonviolent crime? How do we address issues like, and we talked about this last week, homelessness and mental illness and drug use? How do we provide guidance to, a kid in school who's heading down the wrong path? And the question I think that some of these proposals are asking is, should this even be the role of the police, right? Or should it be some sort of different branch of law enforcement we don't have yet, some more like social work, outreach? Is that their job, or is it addressing violent crime? So I mean, that's a can of worms here, but
yeah.
Do you want to talk about that, Shakedra, since you've worked in the Department of Corrections?
Oh yeah, great.
So I think when we hear defund the police, people automatically assume, because they don't really do research a lot or read, that we just want to not have police at all. When in fact, essentially what they're saying is, let's take some of this money that we're giving them to buy cannons and stuff and tanks, and use this money in other areas in the community, which is needed. We need more access to mental health in our communities, especially in our low income and rural areas. So as opposed to hiring another police officer, hire someone in the mental health field that works with the police, so that on these calls where you have someone who is suffering from a mental illness or breakdown, you have that person to go to, or that person can, the same way when we have rape advocates, you know, if something happens, there's somebody that you can call to come there with that particular person. So I think when we throw out words like defund the police and there's not like a lot of explanation, just headlines everywhere, people grab those words and they attach whatever they want to attach. Well, they attach their narrative to it, because even though we're in the age of information, we're also in like a microwave era where we want everything fast. So we will read headlines and not the fine print. And so I think that's what has happened when we start talking about defunding the police, is that people automatically assume that we're saying no police at all.
Yeah, it's not it.
I forget the expression. It's, what is it? When all you have is a hammer, you see everything as a nail.
Right.
So it's the idea of breaking the association that policing equates to law, order, punishment, and a militaristic approach to social problems, right? Hammer, nail. We need more tools at our disposal for law enforcement to like broaden out, not just like you said, the tanks and cannons.
This is a phrase I've heard, and I will attach this to defunding the police. If you give a monkey a gun, the first person he's going to shoot is you, because he doesn't know what else to do with it. So we continue to fund police officers, offices, and the first people that are hurt are the citizens, when in fact what they are supposed to do is protect and serve. And it just seems like the more we shine a light on it, they're doing a lot more harm sometimes than protecting and serving. So if we're going to give them these tools, you know, we need to also give them the training to use these tools properly. So instead of all of these tanks and stuff, let's give them mental health workers. Let's give them liaisons that go between them and the community. Because if you're not familiar with the community, or you work in a community where you have biases or you have fears about a particular set of people, you're going to go in nervous.
Yeah.
You're going to go in on edge already. And so, I mean, it's just so much.
You know, you said protect and serve, and I was going to talk about this earlier and got away from me. You know, one thing that followed after the protest was, you know, all these kind of supercuts of the different incidents that have occurred over the years, right? And they all blend together in a way where you remember them, but collectively as a society, we've forgotten about them because we're encouraged to keep moving and we get distracted. And so in a strange way, as awful as it was to see it, like here is this string of incidents, and the one that just jumps back into my head was that little girl in South Carolina who was picked up and body slammed, not giving up her cell phone. And so you think about that, and I didn't know a single officer of the several, 24 that I know in the area who supported that, right? But protect and serve, and then give us a couple, dozen of those incidents. Those don't go together. There's a problem, right? Body slamming a little girl because she wouldn't give up a cell phone.
And here's where mental health could have came into that. It's my understanding that the little girl had just lost a parent or something.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
But she had the phone. Yes. Because she was, communicating with somebody about this major. I think she had just lost her mom. So of course she's not going to give you that phone.
Yeah.
Of course she's not. And here's where mental health could have come in. But even before that, why are we bringing police to an issue that an administrator in the school should have handled? Because no one was in danger.
Right.
No one was in danger. You know what I mean? No one, even the little 6-year-old girl in Florida that they arrested and put in handcuffs. And I think she spent 2 days or something like that somewhere because they had the authority to do that to a 6-year-old. So and didn't feel bad about it. The guy said, "Oh, the youngest person I arrested was 8. She's just broken my record." What? and you're okay with arresting a 6-year-old? I mean, to the point where you put zip ties around her hand. She's a 6-year-old.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely disconcerting because, I mean, anybody who understands kids knows that kids their brains are not fully developed till they're like 25. So they do not understand their actions in the same way that adults do. So you can't fault them for that. You have to understand children. And it is terrifying that we have a whole, law enforcement situation where we apparently are this is why we have a juvenile delinquent system, right? This is why we have a different system to deal with children, because they're supposed to be treated differently, not as adults.
Right.
And we have definitely failed children, it seems like.
Absolutely.
We have.
Even when it comes to the juvenile delinquency, even when it comes to, juvenile detention centers, in large, Black kids, when it comes to school offenses, are sent to those detention centers for activities that are not essentially criminal.
Yes.
Missing school is not a reason to be sent off to a detention center.
Put in the system.
Find out why this kid is missing school. Is it that mom is working and he's getting up late? Is it that mom and dad are sick or something and they're taking care of younger siblings? But it's even with that in the juvenile detention, when it comes to juvenile detention, in large, it is Black and brown children that are in there for crime, for supposed crime, but it's not criminal behavior, but they're there. It's ridiculous. It is. I think when we talk about policing, and it's so wide because now we have police officers in our school systems.
Yes.
So it's like everywhere our children go, they are being policed. They are being handled as criminals. And so it's easy to understand for me why being pulled over by a police officer will cause you to be in fight or flight mode, because we know that just being pulled over could mean death for us. And for not even doing anything wrong. The guy shot at the gas station. The police officer said, "Get your license." He get his license. The police officer shoots him. Philando Castile getting his license. He's killed in front of his kid. Not only do they shoot him in front of his daughter and her mother, but then they put the mother in handcuffs as if she had committed a crime. It's just so much. When I tell you, being Black in America is a mental disease in itself. It is difficult being Black in America. Add on being a Black woman in America with Black sons. It's difficult living here. It's stressful every day.
Fully agree with you.
With stop and frisk and being pulled over, and that seems to be, for me, the recurring kind of struggle is getting people to understand that the overwhelming consensus in the literature in sociology and criminology is that it's biased. I mean, one of the most robust studies looked at, I believe it was the NYPD, for the amount of stops for each racial category. So here's some numbers real quick. So of their stops, this is over an 8-year period from 2004 to 2012, 52% of those stopped were Black, 31% were Hispanic, 10% were white. And you could argue, well, maybe there were more Black in that area, more white were living outside. Set that to the side. Here's the breakdown. The police needed 143 stops to get one seizure of drugs or guns for Black Americans. So 143 stops equals one seizure. For Hispanics, it was 99. 99 stops gave them, yield of one. For whites, it was 27. So putting this in a different way, the hit rate for people of color was much lower than that for whites, right? who are stopping so many more people of color because, quote, they're more likely to have contraband. Their own data, this wasn't some person who made this up, this was the police department's own data, betrayed that assumption. So, you know, if you pause for a second and think about what that means, what that does to the relationship between law enforcement and the Black community, which I certainly don't have any experience with what that feels like being a white guy in America. But if one group is getting stopped much more often with lower hit rates, you know, think about the kind of shared experiences that emerge, the stories that are told about the time you were stopped. And of course, I didn't have anything on me. I don't do drugs, or I don't own a gun. And then someone across the table from you says, yeah, I got stopped last week. Those are the conversations that are happening that white America doesn't know about. You know, how do members of that community start to see police officers? And then what do they see the role of law enforcement in our society to be when they're getting stopped, and it's less likely that they've done anything wrong, but it's just justified over and over. So I think that's outside of our view as white Americans. We don't understand that concrete lived experience. It's so foreign to us, you know? Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So this is great. We have like, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes left. So I just wanted to wrap up with one question. We had a comment from the thread about corruption and whether it was possible to fix a system that is kind of, there's rampant corruption. And then also, just something I'm going to add on to that is that the incentives seem like they're all wrong, right? All the incentives are to arrest more people, to show what you've done in terms of stopping people and stopping crime. And that doesn't seem like the right way to go. Another suggestion that was made last week on the thread was to have a national registry of law enforcement officers, so that officers who had been fired for bad behavior from one state couldn't go to just another state and get rehired, which has happened apparently a wide number of times. So what kinds of solutions are possible? What are some realistic solutions given the racism which permeates policing, the problem of corruption, of planting evidence, and which we've seen already this year on camera. I think that having video cameras by private citizens is probably the best thing that could have ever happened, to show people what was actually happening. But what are some solutions? Can the system be fixed, or do we just need to try other solutions instead? I feel like I'm in a situation where I'm like trying to parent my kids, and you're like, this is not working, right? We need to do, let's redirect, let's try something else.
Yeah, I think we can start with charging, convicting, and then sentencing those who do the wrong thing, whether they're corrupt or doing or using excessive force. And that's in all areas, down from the chief to the officers to the coroner, because let's face it, sometimes the coroner is going to make it so that the police look innocent. In George Floyd case, the coroner said basically that he died of natural causes, although he had a knee on his neck. So I think by holding everybody in every position accountable when they go against what is right. And I think we see too much of that. Nobody is being held accountable. So when we're not held accountable, we need to either vote these people out, or they need to be not only fired but also prosecuted. I mean, if they didn't have titles and they did these type of things, they would be prosecuted, no question. And I don't think having a title should exempt them from that.
There's been some good movement, in my opinion, lately on, and I think it's the Walter Scott Notification Act. I might be wrong on this. And a senator from our state, Tim Scott, proposed it. And it's one of the things that's consistent between both Democratic and Republican proposals, is to have some sort of national registry for police shootings. So we know what happened, you know, and this is great for social scientists because it'll have the victim's name, race and age, the officer's name, race and age, you know, armed or not. And so that would allow us to understand the scope of the problem. And then there's another proposal, I think it's some sort of accountability where it's a registry of those who've been charged with some sort of misconduct. A little vague. I'd like to know what counts as misconduct. Is it an inappropriate remark? Is it multiple reports of, you know, racist or sexist comments at work? Like some way to track so people don't just get moved around. You know, you had too many complaints of excessive force, so we're transferring you, something that could go with them. So that actually gives me hope. More body cams and lapel cams and dash cams, in addition to, as Julinna pointed out, more citizens recording with their phones. This is wonderful for accountability. And I haven't seen any research on body cameras that show any negative outcomes. Most of the time, it actually clears the officer. It shows that the good cops were doing what they said they were doing. But that smaller percentage of the time, it also catches the people who are misbehaving. We want that, right? We want to have trust in the good police officers who are following the rules and the guidelines and behaving in an appropriate manner. And we definitely want to catch the ones who are abusing their power and putting citizens' lives and health and well-being at risk. So those do give me some hope that for accountability, right? It's a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think the when we talk about national registries, and I don't know how police officers do it, but I know when I leave one job and go to another job, they ask, can I call your previous employer?
Mm-hmm.
And if there is something negative, pardon me, that I have done, it's my understanding that that previous employer would definitely tell them that. So I think with police officers, is that not the case? I mean, some of these police officers were in some high profile situations. So like, I believe it's Darren Floyd, and he was hired again. So there are these places where the racism is so high and so engraved in the police forces that these people will get hired to police no matter what. So I think we have to find an alternative to that. So that means once you are accused and it's been proven that you have done these type of things, that you no longer can be in law enforcement, period. Because to have a registry and then still get hired, because some of these police officers were all over the national news, so I know the agency that hired them knew what they had done and the lack of care and concern. So I think we need to just ban them altogether from being in law enforcement once they cross that threshold, because it would just be just like the priests who were molesting children. They just moved them from church to church, and they didn't stop molesting children. They just found new victims. And I believe when we move these police officers from place to place, that they just find new victims. And so I think they need to do a better job of policing themselves. And then why would you want to hire someone like that's not going to bring any integrity or be an asset to your organization, unless the intent of your organization is to harm people?
Yeah, no, I think everything you said is exactly right, Shakedra. And it reminded me of something else that I'd heard, which is that the pay scales for police aren't that great. And so there may not be attracting, right, the high quality applicants that you would want to be serving in such an important position. So there's probably a wide range of factors, right, that go into to explaining why we have the people who become police officers that do, which is not to say, again, that they're all bad. They're not, right? There's some great ones out there, but given the way that the system functions overall, it makes it, like as Matt was saying, it makes it a lot easier for bad apples to act in a system that that may incentivize them in the opposite direction. So this has been a great discussion. I'm just going to ask you guys to see if you have any final thoughts or comments or anything that you wanted to say that you that I didn't actually hit upon or ask the right question that you might want to add here as we wrap up.
Go ahead. I'm thinking. I don't think I do.
I would just like to say that I do believe all of this starts with us as individuals. The first teachers are the women. We carry the children in our womb for hopefully 9 months or close to it, and then we keep them close to our bosom until they're walking and, you know, up and moving around. So I think a lot of this starts at home. Although I do understand that our children will be influenced by things outside of our home, essentially the core of them will be mostly influenced by what we do in our households. So in our households as individuals, if we teach our children to recognize color, to recognize that they have privilege at no fault of their own, because, you know, we don't choose our parents. So teach them to recognize their privilege, but also how to operate in it as an ally. Because a lot of times I meet children who don't understand that they have privilege until they're put into a situation and it's like in the forefront, and then they don't know what to do with it or how to maneuver, you know, in that privilege that they have, again, at no fault of their own. So I think just as individuals, we need to start in our homes with our children and ourselves, just accepting our own biases and, you know, really trying to figure out if this is what I believe or is this what I've been taught, and then deal with it.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and you gave me something to talk about, because it does start with individuals, right? And it does start with us, especially, you know, speaking as white guy in society, for white America to listen and pay attention. And it's been so frustrating over so many years seeing the dismissiveness and the defensiveness, and I guess I'm trying to say, just because you can look away and forget about it because it doesn't immediately affect you, or you quote don't get it, or I'm not really sure that's the way it works, doesn't mean it doesn't affect someone else. And just the simplest act that we can do is to shut off our defense mechanisms and our dismissiveness and ignore the distractions and just pay attention and listen. And as we said at the beginning of this conversation, that's kind of been forced on us with this pandemic and with social media and it falling right into our lap. So now I think the task is, let's not get distracted. You know, all of us together, keep focusing on it and coming up with, you know, solutions. Be critical, but also let's move forward.
Absolutely. And understand that just because you're offended doesn't mean that you're right. And I think in most conversations, that's what I found when we talk about the issues that we're facing as Black people. It portrays white people in a bad light. And I do understand that not all white people are bad, but because it portrays them in a bad light, people get offended and then they get defensive.
Yes.
So to saying that just because you're offended doesn't necessarily mean that you're right. It means that there are some things that I am causing you to examine within yourself, and that's uncomfortable.
Yes, perfectly put.
Yep, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, on that note, my goal is to be an accomplice. I remember Shakedra giving a workshop on how to be an ally or an accomplice. So I think, so this was our second one tonight, but I think that you guys ended with something that was really important, which is that we need to continue the conversation. So we at Grand Strand Action Together will attempt to do that. We had, I mean, well over 1,000 views of our video last week. I expect that we'll have a lot tonight. You guys have given us a lot to think about, and we are going to push forward here in the local community and do what we can to sort of mend race relations, try to, you know, become more aware of what we can do for the people in our own communities who are hurting and struggling. And I'd say that for myself as well. Right. And, you know, I just thank you guys for coming and for speaking your heart and giving us everything that we needed to know and we needed to hear tonight. And so we'll keep doing our best to keep doing that. So thank you guys both very much. Thank you. All right,
Thank you.
and I will sign off here, and we look forward to another discussion like this soon.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Guys, all right, bye.
Mhm.